Could the South have won the Civil War? Absolutely, although the idea of an inevitable Union victory is an important part of Lost Cause mythology. Similar to the Nazi mythology about Jews causing Germany to lose World War I, the Lost Cause seeks to shift blame for the Confederacy's defeat away from the actions of its leaders. The South lost not because of mistakes made on the battlefield, but because the North had bigger numbers.
It's pretty much impossible for the South to win militarily. Lower population, less industrialization, all that fun stuff.
Robert E. Lee, though he might have rivaled Napoleon Bonaparte and Alexander the Great combined, couldn't overcome the iron law of bigger number equals win.
The Confederates could not win the Civil War on the battlefield. No matter how many great generals the South had, Northern industry, manpower, and more importantly, Scott's Anaconda Plan were always going to prevail given enough time.
In his farewell address after Appomattox, Lee encouraged this idea, stating that, quote, "The Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources," end quote. This attempt to shift blame serves no other purpose than to gas up the Confederacy. There is no loss of honor in losing a war you never could have won, but there is honor in determination. It is not an attempt at honesty, but an attempt to distort your perception of the past. And, to quote George Orwell, whoever controls the past controls the future. Modern Civil War historiography not only rejects the lost cause, but freely acknowledges that the South could have won.
Old Shelby Foote, yes, South never could have won that war. But the South could have won that war.
A far more accurate assessment of the Civil War, in the words of military historian Bevan Alexander, is that, quote, "Despite the odds, wars are won by human beings," end quote. If you've been watching my channel since the beginning, this shouldn't be a shocking take. My first video is about the earliest chance the South had to win, after all. This video, in contrast, is a revision. Rather than months, the Confederate States could have gained its independence in a matter of days following the attack on Fort Sumter, and I'm going to explain how. Friday, April 12th, 1861. A date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the infantry and artillery of the Confederate States of America. After 34 hours, Major Robert Anderson surrendered to General P.G.T. Beauregard, ending the first battle of the Civil War with a Confederate victory. Was this a mistake? Maybe, but the attack had some benefits. Jefferson Davis was under a lot of political pressure, particularly from South Carolina, the most rabid fire-eating state, to take the fort. If he hadn't sent in the troops, Francis Pickens would have sent in the militia. Not to mention, how could an allegedly independent nation allow an alien fort to be held against its will in its own territorial waters? Following Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, 4 new states seceded and came under the Confederate banner. With the exception of Arkansas, these states provided great amounts of industry and manpower for the new nation, not to mention excellent generals from Virginia. I highly doubt that a confederacy of just the Deep South could have survived on its own. Regardless of the beneficial and detrimental aspects of Fort Sumter, the war was on, and to gain independence, the South had to avoid defeat. There was a good reason to think this was possible: the immense territorial extent of the Confederacy. At 750,000 square miles, it was twice the size of the 13 colonies. Because Lincoln's aim was to restore the Union in its entirety, the task he faced was far greater than the task King George III had faced in 1776. The military analyst of the London Times wrote early in the war that, quote, "It is one thing to drive the rebels from the south bank of the Potomac, or even to occupy Richmond, but another to reduce and hold in permanent subjugation a tract of country nearly as large as Russia and Europe. No war of independence ever terminated unsuccessfully except where the disparity of force was far greater than it is in this case. Just as England during the Revolution had to give up conquering the colonies, so the North will have to give up conquering the South," end quote. Yet the greatest advantage the Confederates had in April 1861 is that they were prepared for a fight. The U.S. Army consisted of only 16,000 troops, most of which were west of the Mississippi fighting Native Americans. General-in-Chief Winfield Scott told Lincoln that, quote, "General Beauregard commands more men in Charleston than I command on the continent east of the frontier," end quote. By contrast, the Confederacy had been preparing an army for months prior to Fort Sumter. The southern states had gotten their military machines up and running as soon as they left the Union, calling up up and equipping troops that by Fort Sumter had weeks or even months of training. When the provisional government was established in February, Davis, as commander-in-chief, already had an army under his command. On March 6th, the Confederate Congress authorized the raising of 100,000 men for service, and by April 12th, 37% of that quota had been filled. In the words of Ohio Senator John Sherman, quote, "In the South, the people were earnest, fierce, and angry, and were evidently organizing for action, whereas in the North, I saw not the least sign of preparation." The South was in a prime position to strike the first blow after Fort Sumter, and many already had a target in mind: Washington, D.C. At the time, only 1,500 troops stood guard to protect the capital. The city had no natural defenses, and the only fort defending Washington, the fort of the same name in Maryland, was 7 miles down the Potomac and manned by a single soldier. Several Confederate leaders called for Beauregard, who would become a hero in the South, to march north and chase Lincoln out of the White House. Secretary of War Leroy Pope Walker stated in a speech in Montgomery only hours after Confederate guns had opened fire on Fort Sumter that, quote, "I will prophesy that the flag which now flaunts the breeze here will float over the dome of the old Capitol at Washington before the 1st of May. Former Louisiana Senator John Slidell wrote to Davis on the 24th that, quote, "In a contest like this, the boldest course is the safest. We can, I think, take and hold Washington, and if we do so, can soon dictate our own conditions of peace," end quote. Vice President Alexander Stephens, during his trip by rail from Montgomery to Richmond, advocated capturing Washington in nearly every speech he gave. Union leaders also recognized that the South could have won the war swiftly. Walker's counterpart, Edwin Stanton, predicted the same thing as Walker on the same day, quote, "that in less than 30 days Davis will be in possession of Washington." Even Lincoln, a man with little to no experience in military affairs, saw the path to Confederate victory, quote, "If I were Beauregard, I would take Washington," end quote.
Oh, that's why they call it that.
The only possible issue would have been actually reaching Washington, since Virginia and North Carolina had not yet seceded. The circumstances changed on April 17th, as Virginia seceded from the Union and North Carolina's governor, John W. Ellis, wrote to Davis to, quote, "Come as soon as you choose. We are ready to join you to a man. Strike the blow, what the fuck? Strike the blow quickly and Washington will be ours." Both states had also rejected Lincoln's call for volunteers, so their pro-Confederate governments would not have stopped the northern movement of Southern troops. Among the 7,000 soldiers in Charleston, Beauregard could have left 500 behind to man Sumter and gone north of the rest by rail, arriving in Virginia 36 hours later to seize Washington with little resistance. The ramifications of such a bold and brilliant dash would have transformed the war and changed the course of history. The loss of the nation's capital would likely not only have hastened the secession of the states of the Upper South, but also would have brought at least Maryland, if not also Kentucky and Missouri, into the Confederate fold. The Union's capital would then have been truly isolated from the South, and the front line shifted north to the Susquehanna. An insurrection that captured the ruling nation's capital also likely would have been awarded the diplomatic recognition of the nations of Europe, in particular Great Britain and France. This would have afforded the South access to immense financial and material resources and raised the possibility of a two-front war that the Union would have been unlikely to win. The most grave possibility, however, would have been the capture of Lincoln himself. There would have been little means of escape available to the president, as there were no ships available to sail down the Potomac, and passage through Baltimore ran the risk of being killed by Southern sympathizers, as was the case when Lincoln traveled through Baltimore to get to Washington for his inauguration. The capture of the enemy head of state would have allowed Davis to dictate whatever peace terms he wished, likely the independence of all slave states, with the possible exception of Delaware, and the addition of the territory south of Kansas into the Confederacy. This is how Texas had won its own revolution 25 years earlier. The Mexican president Santa Anna was captured at the Battle of San Jacinto and forced to agree to the independence of territory far beyond what the Texans had controlled. What was to be done with Washington should the city have ever been captured was never agreed upon. Some Southerners, including First Lady Varina, envisioned it becoming the new capital of the Confederacy. Others wanted the city to be left to rot or outright destroyed, its ruins left as a symbol of the folly of the Union. Thankfully for the millions of enslaved African Americans in the South, none of these ambitions ever came to fruition. Beauregard had no interest in a move towards Washington, concerning himself more with the defense of Charleston and the lower Mississippi, despite acknowledging that an attempt by the North to retake Sumter would be, quote, madness, end quote. Once Robert E. Lee assumed command of Virginia's military on April 24th, he stated that, quote, "We will act on the defensive," end quote, and to, quote, "let it be known that we intend no attack," end quote. The day after that, New York and Massachusetts militia arrived in the capital, eliminating the Confederacy's chances of winning the war in a matter of days. Yet none of these obstacles were insurmountable. As commander-in-chief of the Confederate States Army, Jefferson Davis could have ordered Beauregard north regardless of what he felt. However, he believed that the South was only defending itself in a war of northern aggression, and therefore the Confederacy Confederacy only needed to deflect the Union's attacks until the Northern people gave up, or until European empires, hungry for Southern cotton, intervened. Davis essentially wanted to surrender the agency of his country in the war, and was relying on his enemies to make errors. When he guessed wrong about the will of the Northern people to continue the war, or the reluctance of Europe to intervene without an offensive military victory, the only alternative left for the Confederacy was destruction. This policy, commonly taught at West Point, which discouraged the necessity of speed in warfare, was unpopular among Southern soldiers and civilians, who demanded action. After Stonewall Jackson's Shenandoah Valley campaign of 1862 showed what a war fought offensively could accomplish, the Richmond Daily Whig sarcastically said that, quote, "This man Jackson must be suppressed, or else he will change the humane and Christian policy of the war and demoralize the government. Down with him, or he will establish the independence of the Southern Confederacy," end quote. Unlike Lincoln, who recognized that he was lacking in military experience and left soldiering to the soldiers, Davis believed that he was a military genius. He was certainly a fine administrator during his time as Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce, and a capable battlefield commander during his time leading volunteers during the Mexican War, but none of this translated to an effective ability to develop and execute military strategy. Davis's belief in his own military mastery only compounded his pre-existing narcissism and stubbornness. James Campbell, a postmaster general who served alongside Davis in the Pierce administration, described him as, quote, "one of the most stubborn slavery men I have ever met." One of Davis's clerks in the War Department, William Lee, described the man as, quote, "a regular bulldog when he formed an opinion, for he would never let go," end quote. The Confederate president's closed-mindedness, inflexibility, and limited strategic vision meant that he was the wrong man to carry the South to victory in the Civil War. Had Vice President Stevens occupied the highest office in the Confederacy after Fort Sumter, the South would probably be a separate country today. It's a bit humorous that my revised thesis about the Civil War has come to the same conclusion as the original, but the reason I disagree with the first video on my channel is because of the date. July 1861 wasn't the greatest opportunity for the Confederate States to have won the American Civil War, it was April. The reason why both of these opportunities were squandered, and indeed the primary reason why the South lost, was not because of a deficiency in men or materiel, but a deficiency in leadership. I'm the Counterfactor, and thanks for watching.
Big bang bang roll, got cheat codes. Certified in the hood, boy, they all know. Don't be asking y'all that you gotta know to know. Got a pocket full of cash, so the whole boat. See, I've been thugging since a young and I ain't got a bang. My name been ringing bells since I was like 14. Been service stacking from all of the dope fiends. And I ain't tripping, y'all could get it,